Ambassador Bridge Company, Mr. Matthew Maroon. But first we're going to have a bit of a presentation by Senator John Pappageorge, who's on our Appropriations Committee. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. You might ask why I'm here. There is a relationship between policy and appropriations, and we appropriators say we draw the line beyond which policy makers take great risks if they cross it. But the fact is there's a relationship here, because whatever the policy is going to be, it's going to have to be reflected in the appropriations process, and specifically in my budget. And that's what brings me here today. So if I can proceed, sir.
Go right ahead, Senator.
As this chart says, history is replete with bad outcomes because we solved the wrong problem. And so my first concern is, are we looking at the right problem? And this bridge issue could be a case in point. The perceived problem, long delays, and they're going to be worse in the future. The answer to that perceived problem is build another bridge, because their capacity is not there. The question is capacity really the problem? Oops. Where the heck is it? There it is. If you look at these three lines, this is the Ambassador Bridge, this is the tunnel, and this is the Blue Water Bridge. Capacity peaked in 1999 at 52%. It is now around 35%. I want you to pay attention to the slope of this line here. The projection says that straight line on about 45-degree angle all the way out to 2035. Now, it wasn't long after I was head of the Futures Group for the Strategic Studies Institute at Carlisle a number of years ago that we realized a straight line projection into the future, first of all, denies the law of diminishing returns. Here's what I think happened with this projection. It went back 30 years, did a regression analysis, and straightened out all the bumps into a straight line, then projected it out, 25 years, whatever. In the old days, I don't know if it's still true, that particular forecast had a wonderful name. It was called the surprise-free environment. And what it meant is if nothing changes, whatever happened for 30 years is going to keep right on happening. The chances of a surprise-free environment occurring approach 0. I just put up 3 surprises there. The big 3 market share is no longer 70%, it's 45%. We all know about the economic decline. We all know about Detroit casinos, and if it really took a lot of time, you could find more things that happened in the last 30 years that won't happen in the future. And as I said earlier, a straight line projection denies the law of diminishing returns. Now, even if we took that straight line and moved it from 2003 to 2010, it would not exceed the bridge capacity. There was also a study done, I'm not really familiar with it, except its outcome, called the HALCRO, and that said, here's what's really going to happen. Now let's talk about forecasting. The world's an S-shaped curve, and when you get past the flex point, the law of diminishing returns starts taking effect. So depending on where you think you are on that curve, those lines can go all kinds of ways. As near as I can tell, here's the one that was used. Now let's go back to 1991. Blue Water Bridge. This is the MDOT projection, straight line, almost on a 45-degree angle. Here's what really happened over the last 20 years. Some other things to consider. Center for Transportation Research. Majority of toll road projects, first 5 years, the overestimate on the traffic is 20 to 30%. S&P study in 2005 reviewed 104 toll road projects, concluded that volume projections were overestimated by approximately 30%. In actuality, I don't believe we have a capacity problem. We have a throughput problem. Let me explain. The Ambassador Bridge, come on, there you are. The Ambassador Bridge has 32 inspection stations. The Canadian side of the Ambassador Bridge has 29, but 6 have not been used, and I'm not sure they're usable because there's a problem with trucks turning around and so forth. So you still have 23. Now, traffic across the bridge, the speed limit is 40 miles an hour. The speed limit at the inspection stations is 0. Now, if I don't man sufficient stations, I'm going to have traffic back up. So one of the issues that I've come across is the argument of who's manning enough stations. The Ambassador folks say we man as many as we need to keep the traffic moving. The accusation is that on the Canadian side, they man fewer stations. One assertion is they man 25% fewer booths than U.S. Customs. Now here's a slide I flat don't understand. The Canadian consulate office, a member of that office, said to me and others that 96% of the time delays are less than 20 minutes. So how are we getting these long delays if 20 minutes is the answer for 96% of the cases? So is this slide arguing that we don't have a throughput problem either? Now, I just make the point, if I had a bunch of trucks going through my city of Troy, I would hate it. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask, is one of the problems too much traffic going through Windsor? That's a legitimate problem to attack. So is there a truck bypass? Well, I confess I'm not a big expert on what goes on over there. I started out with the notion that if the 401, I'm told there are 17 traffic lights between Toronto and Mexico, and they're all in Canada. And they're all between the 401 and the Ambassador Bridge. The Canadians are going to do something about that at quite a cost to them. They're going to take out 14 lights. And somewhere around here, where this is now a 2-lane highway here and not a 4 anymore, they would head southwest to the new site. Now, it turns out there's also a little used railroad track here that raises the possibility of putting a road over it. Now, if you do that, you run into all kinds of problems because there's a historical site in there and so forth. But the point I'm making is, are we looking at the real problem? Now, let me also talk a little bit about transportation funding. We send our money to the feds, and they return something between 92 and 93% back to Michigan. But they only give us our own money back if we match it with another 20% of our money. It's a good deal for the feds. We're taxing our people to build roads for them. Now, if you exceed the 92%, you don't get $4 back. You get 92.5% back this year. And the feds have said the governor can use the Canadian $550 million as part of the federal match. It did not promise more money beyond the 92.5% that is returned to Michigan. So those of you who are reading, we're going to get an extra $2.2 billion. It's not the case. We're going to get $2.2 billion with our federal match, with however we match it. And that just makes the point. I believe the way the $2 billion number came is somebody took $50 million, multiplied it by 10 years, assuming every year $50 million would be Canadian. That gets you $500 million, and then multiply by 4, and you get to $2 billion. But let me emphasize, all we're going to get back is 92.5% or some number close to that if we match it. Now, what did we do this year? Oops. This year, the governor proposed $50 million in toll credits. I took that $50 million out and replaced it with $50 million in ambassador toll credits. Now, let me explain how toll credits work. If you do something on a bridge and it meets 6 federal criteria, then you get credit for the amount of money you spent that met those 6 criteria. The ambassador people said they had, I forgot the number, $200 million worth. And they offered them whether there was a bridge or not. Well, the question was, did they meet all 6 criteria? The difficulty in answering that question is you get involved with proprietary data. So the administration hired a third-party CPA to look at the Ambassador Bridge books, and they determined for sure that however big that number was to begin with, for sure $50.7 million would meet the federal criteria. And that's how I wound up putting $50 million in toll credits. Now, why? This is without prejudice to whether or not we have a bridge because I wanted to make sure we met our federal match this year. And nobody really argued with this being an insurance policy here. And that just sums up what I said. Now, what happened as a result of that, now we have time to address the policy question of whether or not another bridge should be built while assuring that our federal match is good to go. A lot of questions come up next. How are we going to finance the thing? Will taxpayers be put at risk, and so forth? The difficulty in comparing a new bridge with an existing bridge is pretty obvious. The new bridge is perfect. There's no friction. It's a nice picture. I haven't seen a picture, but I'm sure there's one. And there are no cost overruns, nothing. This just sits there. Meantime, the Ambassador Bridge is existing, and it has its problems. Another point, North American bridge construction costs exceeded initial estimates by 25.7%. So I went to the bond guys and I said, if we had to bond for $2.5 billion, why $2.5 billion? Because I took the expected $2 billion and I applied the 30% rule and so forth and kicked it up a little to be safe. Now, if it's a strong AA rating, the market rate's going to be about 5, 5.25. The payments, the mortgage payments, would be about $165 million a year, and we're going to end up at the end of 30 years having spent $5 billion. It's a moderate rating, 6%, $175 million is the mortgage, $5.4 billion at 6%. A weak rating, 6.75 to 7, $195 million, $5.9 billion. Now this assumes that there are availability payments. If there are no availability payments, add another point here. What's an availability payment? As near as I can figure out, this is what it is. They're guaranteed payments made by a government project sponsor. And again, if there are no availability payments, the market rate will have to be higher. Those are the kinds of questions that eventually the approach people are going to have to deal with, even if it looks like there's no cost on our side. Now, I wonder how there can be no cost in a public-private partnership. What do we bring to the table? For the railroad coming up Woodward, the private folks put up $100 million, but we put up about $9 million. I wonder who'll pay any attention to us if we show up with zero. And I'm just raising these questions to indicate that I don't believe this is the kind of issue, in light of all the other infrastructure problems we have and a whole bunch of smaller bridges that are falling down, whether we should put this through this month. We got, what, 6 more meetings or 5? And so that's my doubt. And I'm ready for any questions that someone would have.
Okay, thank you, John. Senator Knopf, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, for being here. In the first part of your presentation, you talked about capacity and total capacity of the bridge.
Yeah.
And if I remember your testimony, is 52% presently, or it's down from 52. It's down from 52.
It was 52. It is now around 35.
34.
But there's an uptick, if you noticed, at the end.
Yeah. What happens, I mean, that's just part of the equation, if you look at this project.
Right.
Obviously, on one side, the American side, USA side, Michigan side, there is access to the bridge and what is its capacity. And on the other side, even after you get through, whether your presentation with the customs and, you know, how many stations they had, let's say they were all full. So that wasn't a problem or perceived problem. What's the capacity of the roadways that dump down into Windsor, and have you looked at and seen any of those numbers, the capacity of that two-lane roadway?
No, and you raise a good question. I have the same question. We don't know right now. I'm sure the folks who run the bridge know, but we don't know whether the problem is the inspection station where they all split out and go to one, and then they have to come together and get on a two-lane road, whether it's the two-lane road, manning of inspection stations, or whatever. You got to get some operations research guys with a stopwatch and a clipboard and a cell phone, and on both sides of the bridge saying, here comes a blue truck, it left my place at such and such a time, and just figure all that out.
I just wondered, that's what I said, because you mentioned some of the studies you'd read, and I didn't know if you had read any information on
No, all the studies I've read
of the entrance and exit ramps.
All the studies I've read are at a higher level. They don't get into that kind of detail. For all we know, the real problem is the plaza's too small.
Maybe.
But none of that has been looked at, and I believe 50% of solving any problem is defining it properly. And I have some concerns that we may not have done that.
And I guess just real quick follow-up, the other point is that if you had to look at, I mean, the one point that was made yesterday, it appears the site selection of that side of this seems to be better if no parties were involved. You just looked at a map and where to put a brand new bridge. It would seem like freeway to freeway connecting into 401, the site that they picked would be viable.
Yeah, as I said, that one's friction-free. We were sitting around here 100 miles from the site, and I said, guys, my background's military. Let's get a helicopter and fly over this thing. We're 100 miles away. And when you fly over it, you see a bridge that's got stuff, and you can see where something might not be right. At the other site, it's nice and clean. There's nothing there. And it could be a great site.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Emmons?
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for being here. And I, too, had an issue with your first slide regarding the capacity. Just a question, is that slide, that number from MDOT, where did you get the?
MDOT.
It is an MDOT. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Both of them, the Blue Water Bridge, too. By the way, they're having overrun problems there, as you know, to the tune of $400 million that the feds have to cough up.
Thank you, Senator. I know you'll be around for a while.